to Deep Sleep Stories. If these stories have helped you through restless nights, please leave a review. Reviews are what help this podcast grow, reach more listeners, and stay alive. Without them, even something meaningful can slowly disappear. So if this show has brought you comfort, that small act truly helps keep it going. Now, settle in, and let's begin.
Welcome to Deep Sleep Stories, where your only task is to rest. Tonight, you're going to drift into a gentle place that feels both familiar and quietly enchanted, following the hush that comes after a passing rain until you find yourself in a greenhouse where every leaf is jeweled with water and every breath tastes clean and new. So let your body settle just as it is. Let your shoulders soften. Let your jaw unclench. And allow your tongue to rest comfortably. Breathe in slowly through your nose, as if you're drawing in cool evening air. Hold for a moment, not tightly, just briefly, and exhale as if you're fogging a window with warmth. Again, a smooth inhale, a gentle pause, a longer, easing exhale. With each breath, imagine you're stepping away from the day's noise, not pushing it aside, not wrestling it, just letting it fall behind you like a coat slipped from your shoulders. The world can wait. The messages can wait. The plans can wait. Right now, all that matters is the soft, steady rhythm of breathing and the quiet story that will carry you toward sleep. Picture the sound of rain, not heavy and sharp, but tender and steady. The way it taps at leaves and roof tiles, then fades into a lingering hush. Notice how your eyelids feel as they grow pleasantly heavy. Notice how your hands become warm and calm. Notice how the space around you seems to widen and soften, as if the air itself is making room for rest. And when you're ready, without trying too hard, let the story begin. There was a small valley that liked to keep secrets. It lay between two low hills where mist often gathered in the mornings, and the evening light tended to arrive in honeyed layers, slow and patient. A narrow lane wound through it, lined with mossy stones and hedges that had learned to grow in gentle curves. At the bend of that lane, just where the air always smelled faintly of wet earth, stood an old greenhouse. It was built with glass panes that didn't match, each one a slightly different shade of clear, pale green or warm, wavering amber. Some panes were rippled with age, as if the glass remembered wind and weather the way a pond remembers thrown stones. The frame was iron, painted long ago in a deep forest color, and the paint had softened over time, worn to satin by rain and sun. It had rained earlier, a long, soaking rain that made the valley feel rinsed and newly made. Now the clouds were thinning, and the sky had that washed, silvery look it gets when the storm has moved on, but the air still holds the memory of water. The greenhouse stood quiet in the aftermath, its roof beaded with droplets. Each drop clung to the glass like a small trembling lantern, catching what light there was and turning it into tiny gleams. Water slid down in slow trails, meeting other trails, joining, separating again. Always moving, always unhurried. Inside, everything was damp in the best way, softened, refreshed, lush with a kind of quiet satisfaction. The air carried the scent of petrichor and leaf green sweetness, the faint mineral tang of wet stone, and the warm breath of soil after it drinks. A person lived nearby in a cottage half hidden by climbing roses and a leaning apple tree that had grown old in peace. This person was named Eloan, and she had the sort of presence that matched the valley, unassuming, steady, and full of small kindnesses. Eloan had tended the greenhouse for years, though tended was not quite the right word. She didn't command the plants. She listened to them. She knew when the ferns wanted more shade, when the citrus trees wished to be turned toward the morning light, when the orchids needed a little more stillness. She knew these things the way some people know how to read a friend's face, without calculation, without strain. It was simply part of her. The rain had brought its own tasks, of course. After a storm, there were always small changes. A gutter that needed clearing, a pot that had shifted on its shelf, a vine that had been tugged by the wind. Eloan liked these tasks. They felt like gentle conversations with the world. In one hand, she carried a small basket. In one hand, she carried a small basket with twine and a cloth, and in the other she held a ring of keys. Though she rarely needed them, the greenhouse door often opened as if it recognized her step. As she approached, the last drops fell from the eaves in slow, satisfied plinks. A robin shook itself out in a nearby shrub, scattering droplets like glitter, then hopped away, leaving the air to settle again. Eloan paused just outside the greenhouse, not because she was hesitant, but because she liked to take in the moment. The hush after rain had a particular texture, like a blanket still warm from the sun. The world seemed to hold its breath, listening to itself. She placed her palm against the door's iron handle. It was cool, but not cold, and a faint vibration of life seemed to hum through it, as if the greenhouse contained not just plants, but a gentle heartbeat. The door eased open with a familiar sigh. Warmth drifted out, wrapped in moisture. It met the cooler air of the valley and made a thin ribbon of mist that curled around Eloan's sleeves before dissolving. Inside, the light was green and dappled, softened by leaves and hanging vines. Droplets clung to everything, the edges of broad philodendron leaves, the delicate needles of rosemary, the fuzzy surfaces of sage. A few drops fell now and then, tapping the soil in slow punctuation. Eloan stepped in and closed the door behind her, not with a click, but with the quiet certainty of a place returning to its own privacy. The greenhouse was arranged like a winding path through a small forest. Narrow walkways of brick and stone led between shelves and benches, between pots and troughs, between trellises where climbing plants made gentle arches. On one side, tall glass jars held cuttings and water, their pale roots like fine lace. On another, a row of terracotta pots housed small citrus trees with glossy leaves, each leaf shining like polished emerald. At the far end stood a table where Elowen kept her tools, a little brush for dusting leaves, small shears, a coil of soft twine, and a watering can that looked too pretty to be practical, painted with faded flowers. Near it was a basin for washing hands, with a bar of soap that smelled of rosemary and rain. Elowen moved slowly, as if her steps were part of the greenhouse's breathing. She didn't hurry. She didn't need to. She began with the simplest task, walking the path and looking. She leaned close to the leaves, not touching at first, just observing. The way water had gathered and the way the plants held themselves. She listened for the small sounds that told her what needed attention. A drip that meant a pot was too full, a slight creak that meant a shelf had shifted, the faint rustle of a vine that had been tugged and needed retying. As she walked, she noticed something she always noticed after rain, how the greenhouse seemed to shine from within. The plants looked brighter, fuller, as if they'd been told a good secret. Even the air felt different, thicker with sweetness, and if she breathed deeply enough, she could almost taste the green. Elowen stopped beside a tray of seedlings. Tiny leaves, no larger than thumbnails, trembled under the weight of droplets. The droplets magnified the leaves' delicate veins, making each one look like a small map. She lifted a corner of the cloth from her basket and gently dabbed the water away, not because the plants would be harmed, but because she liked the care of it. It was a soothing gesture, like smoothing a blanket. As she worked, she hummed, softly, without melody at first, then with a tune that seemed to come from the greenhouse itself. The sound wasn't meant for anyone else. It was simply a companion to her hands. Somewhere above, a vine shifted and let go of a single drop. It fell into a shallow dish with a small, clear plink. Elowen smiled, as if the greenhouse had spoken. In one corner, beneath a hanging basket of trailing ivy, there was a small old chair with a cushion that had been patched many times. Elowen often sat there to rest, or to sip tea, or simply to be surrounded by green. Today she didn't sit, but she glanced at the chair with the fondness one gives to a friend who is always waiting patiently. She moved on to a shelf of herbs, mint, thyme, basil, each one releasing scent when she brushed past. The mint smelled crisp and bright, like cool water. The thyme was earthy and warm. Basil had that tender, peppery sweetness that made the air feel like a kitchen in late summer. After the herbs came the orchids, arranged like quiet stars along a shaded bench. They were delicate, pale, and complicated, with petals shaped like folded silk. Elowen leaned in close, inspecting their roots and leaves, her breath barely moving. And then, as she adjusted a pot and turned it slightly toward the light, she saw something. A faint glow, not bright, not startling, just a small, gentle shimmer near the base of the bench, where a patch of moss had grown in a crack between stones. The moss was normally a deep velvety green, but now it looked as if tiny points of light were nestled within it, like dew that had remembered how to shine. Elowen didn't react quickly. She simply watched, letting her eyes soften, letting her attention become wide and calm. The shimmer pulsed, slow as a sleeping breath. There was something else too, a sense of presence, delicate and quiet, like a whisper that didn't need words. Elowen had lived in the valley long enough to understand that some places held more than what could be easily named. The greenhouse, especially after rain, sometimes felt like the threshold of a dream. Not a frightening dream, a warm one, filled with gentle mysteries. She crouched slowly and reached toward the moss, not touching it, only hovering her fingers above. The air there felt slightly cooler, as if the moss was holding a piece of the rain's memory. The points of light seemed to gather, drifting closer together until they formed a small cluster. For a moment, the cluster looked like nothing more than a trick of wet glass and green shadow. Then it changed. It became very quietly a tiny shape. Not like a human exactly, and not like an insect either. More like a suggestion of a figure made from light and leaf color, as if the greenhouse had drawn something from the space between droplets. It was small enough to rest in the curve of Elowen's palm, though she didn't offer her palm. The shape hovered above the moss, a soft, floating presence, its edges blurring as if it were half mist. It had no sharp features, no clear face, but it had a sense of attention, of awareness. Elowen felt no fear. She felt the opposite, a quiet tenderness, like the feeling of watching a candle burn steadily in a dark room. The little presence drifted upward, slow and wavering, as if it were unsure of the air. It paused near a fern frond, and the fern trembled, not from wind, but from the tiny wake of that gentle movement. Elowen's breath slowed without her thinking about it. She held still, letting the moment unfold at its own pace. The presence moved along the bench, passing over orchid leaves and drifting toward a glass jar where a cutting sat in water. The water in the jar was perfectly still, except for a single ripple that appeared as the glowing shape hovered over it. The ripple spread outward, slow and smooth, then faded. Elowen watched as if she were watching something sacred and ordinary at the same time. After rain, the greenhouse always felt alive. But now it felt alive in a different way, as if the rain had knocked on a hidden door and something had opened. The tiny presence drifted toward a hanging plant where water droplets clung to the ends of vines. It hovered near a droplet, and the droplet brightened, catching the faint glow like a gemstone. Then, as if the droplet had been warmed from within, it released and fell, slow and perfect, to the soil below. The presence followed it down, and when it touched the soil, the glow dimmed, as if sinking gently into the earth. Elowen exhaled, long and easy. She didn't speak. Speaking would have felt too sharp, too loud. Instead, she continued her work, moving slowly, giving the greenhouse what it needed, and allowing the mystery to remain without trying to grab it. She straightened a trellis where a jasmine vine had been tossed by the wind. She tied it with twine, her fingers gentle, the knot loose enough for the vine to grow. Jasmine blossoms, pale and starry, released their scent into the damp warmth, making the air feel like a soft song. As she moved, she noticed other small signs. Nothing dramatic, nothing demanding attention. A droplet that hung in the air a moment longer than it should have before falling. A cluster of leaves that seemed to lean toward her as she passed. The faintest sound like the rustle of silk, though nothing brushed against anything else. The greenhouse after rain was full of these quiet shifts. Elowen made her way to the middle of the greenhouse, where a stone basin collected rainwater from a small channel. The basin's surface held a skin of reflections, leaves, glass panes, a blurred patch of sky. She dipped her fingers into the water. It was cool and clean, and as her fingers moved, the reflections broke into ripples that traveled to the basin's edge and returned, softened. She lifted her hand, and droplets clung to her skin like tiny crystals. She watched them for a moment, then let them fall back into the basin. Everything in the greenhouse seemed to be breathing with her. Outside, the valley remained hushed. The rain had left behind a world that felt freshly washed, and the quiet had a depth to it, like a deep lake. Occasionally, a distant bird called, a soft note that echoed and vanished. Elowen moved to the door of the greenhouse and unlatched a small upper window, just enough to let in a thread of cool air. The air slipped inside like a curious cat, mingling with the warmth, balancing it. Then she went to the table and set down her basket. She took out a small tin, opened it, and the scent of dried chamomile drifted out. She filled a little kettle from the rainwater basin and set it on a small burner she kept for quiet afternoons. Soon the kettle began to sing a low, soothing song. While the water warmed, Elowen continued her gentle walk. Near the back, there was a section of the greenhouse dedicated to plants that liked shadow. Mosses, delicate ferns, small mushrooms that emerged from damp wood. This corner always felt like twilight, even in midday. The light there was soft and green, and the air was cooler. Elowen knelt to check a piece of driftwood she kept in a shallow tray. The driftwood was home to moss and tiny plants that clung like miniature forests. After the rain, the moss looked especially lush, thick and plush like velvet. And again, she saw the faint glow, small points of light nestled among the moss, more numerous now, like a scattered handful of stars. She watched them, and they seemed to respond, brightening slightly, then dimming in a slow rhythm. It was almost like a lullaby made of light. Elowen felt her thoughts become quieter, not empty, just quiet, like a room where someone has drawn the curtains and lit a candle. The kettle's song grew a bit louder, then softened. She stood and returned to the table. Steam rose as she poured hot water over the chamomile. The tea steeped quickly, turning the water a gentle gold. The scent was warm and soothing, like late afternoon sunlight. Alawan carried the cup to the old chair in the corner and sat down. She tucked her feet beneath her, letting her body settle. The cushion under her was soft from years of use. The greenhouse wrapped around her like a blanket of leaves. She held the cup with both hands and breathed in the steam. Her eyes softened as she looked out through the tangle of plants. The faint glow in the moss corner pulsed slowly, almost imperceptibly, like a distant lighthouse seen through fog. Alawan sipped her tea. The warmth spread through her chest, and she let her shoulders drop even more. She didn't think about what she would do later. She didn't plan. She simply sat in the greenhouse after the rain, letting the moment be enough. As she sat, something small moved near the floor, a drift of light, soft as a firefly but steadier, not flickering with urgency. It moved along the brick path, tracing the edge where moss grew between bricks, and it left behind nothing but a sense of calm. The light paused near a pot of lemon balm, and the lemon balm leaves lifted slightly as if stirred by a breath. Then the light drifted onward as though it were exploring or perhaps tending in its own quiet way. Alawan watched without focusing too hard. She allowed her gaze to soften, her eyelids heavy, her mind drifting. The greenhouse held many kinds of life, the obvious life of leaves and stems, and the hidden life of soil and roots, and perhaps, after rain, a delicate life made of dew and shadow. Open and the air shifting gently, the open and the air shifting gently. The chime gave one soft note, then another. The sound was delicate, like a drop of water turning into music. The note seemed to settle in the air, and the plants seemed to listen. Alawan took another sip of tea and let the cup rest in her lap. The light near the floor drifted closer to the stone basin. It hovered above the water, and the water's surface brightened, reflecting a faint glow. The reflection looked like a tiny moon floating in a pond. The light leaned closer, and a single droplet lifted from the water's surface, rising slowly as if the air had become water and water had become air. The droplet hovered, perfectly round, catching the green light of the greenhouse, holding it. Alawan didn't blink quickly. She didn't tense. She simply watched, calm and curious, as if she were seeing something that belonged in the world. The droplet drifted toward a nearby plant, a peace lily whose leaves were broad and dark and glossy. The droplet touched the tip of a leaf, and the leaf shivered, then stilled. The droplet slid down the leaf like a slow pearl, disappearing into the soil. The light dimmed for a moment, then brightened again, very softly. It drifted toward the moss corner where the points of light pulsed, and as it approached, the points seemed to gather closer, like a group of sleepy lanterns drawing together. Alawan's eyelids grew heavier. The warmth of the tea, the damp air, the scent of plants, the lingering hush after rain, it all braided together into something that felt like a gentle spell. Outside, the sky began to shift toward evening. The clouds thinned further and a pale strip of sunset appeared, turning the wet valley into a place of soft glow. Light filtered through the greenhouse glass, scattering into green-gold patterns across leaves and brick. The droplets on the glass panes caught the sunset and turned rosy for a moment, then faded back to clear. Aloan sat in that changing light, as if she were sitting inside a slow-moving painting. The small lights in the moss corner pulsed more slowly now, their rhythm matching the slowing world. Even the leaves seemed to move less, settling into stillness. The wind chime gave one last faint note, then fell silent. Eloan's breathing grew deeper, in and out, slow and steady. The greenhouse held her, and she held the greenhouse, not in a grasping way, but in a shared quiet. Time passed without needing to be counted. At some point, Eloan set her empty cup on the floor beside the chair. She rested her hands on her lap and let her head lean back slightly. Her eyes were half closed, her gaze unfocused. The glass roof above her was a mosaic of fading sky and beads of rain. The tiny lights in the moss corner began to dim, one by one, like candles being gently pinched out. Not suddenly, not with any sense of ending, just a slow settling into darkness. The light near the basin drifted toward the center of the greenhouse, then upward, hovering near a hanging fern. The fern's fronds curved around it as if offering shelter. The light faded, becoming a whisper, then nothing. The greenhouse became simply a greenhouse again, still magical, but in the way all living things are magical, when you pay attention. Aloan opened her eyes a little and smiled. She stood slowly, her joints moving quietly, and stretched her arms above her head. The stretch was unhurried, like waking up without needing to get out of bed. She rolled her shoulders and took one last deep breath of the damp green air. Then she began to close up for the evening. She shut the upper window, easing it down until it fit snugly. She checked the latch on the door. She made a slow walk around the paths once more, not searching for problems, just saying goodnight in her own way. Straightening a leaf here, turning a pot there, brushing a droplet from a petal. The plants seemed to settle as she moved, as if they knew the day was ending. Leaves stopped trembling, droplets stopped falling. The greenhouse became a soft, warm pocket of night. Aloan gathered her basket and her empty cup. She paused at the moss corner and looked down at the velvet green patch. The points of light were gone now, but the moss looked content, lush from the rain, alive with quiet. She placed her fingertips near it, hovering, and felt the coolness. She didn't need to see the glow to know it had been real. Some things didn't need proof, they only needed presence. Then she went to the door, opened it, and stepped out. The valley air was cooler now. The ground was damp and dark, the lane shining faintly. The scent of rain lingered everywhere, and the sky overhead held a soft gradient of dusk. Aloan closed the greenhouse door behind her, and the glass panes reflected the last light like sleepy eyes. She walked back toward her cottage, her boots making gentle sounds. The hedges were heavy with droplets that caught the fading sky. Somewhere nearby, a small stream murmured, fuller from the rain, its voice steady and soothing. At the cottage, Elowen lit a lamp and set her basket down. She moved through the familiar rooms, each one cozy and quiet. The hearth still held warmth from earlier, and the air smelled faintly of wood and dried herbs. She washed her cup, dried it, and placed it back on its shelf. Then she made her own simple evening ritual, nothing elaborate, nothing that required effort. She folded a blanket, smoothed a cushion, checked the latch on the window. Each task was like a soft breath, a gentle letting go. Outside, night settled fully into the valley. The rain clouds were gone now, leaving behind a clear sky where a few stars began to appear, shy at first, then brighter. The greenhouse stood at the bend in the lane, quiet and dark, its glass panes reflecting starlight. Inside, the plants rested, their leaves still, their roots drinking slowly. The air was warm and damp, holding the last sweetness of the day. And in the mossy crack between stones, deep in the shadowy corner, something small and gentle remained. Not a glow now, but a softness, a memory of shimmer, the kind of memory that makes a place feel safe, the kind that lingers like a lullaby, even after the song has ended. The valley breathed, the cottage breathed, the greenhouse breathed. Everything in that little hidden place rested together, as if the rain had washed the world into calm, and the calm had decided to stay. Now the story begins to quiet even more. The greenhouse after the rain is still there, in your mind like a warm pocket of green. The glass panes, the droplets, the soft breath of plants, the stone basin holding reflections, the gentle hush. Let your own breathing become like that hush. In and out, slow and easy. Imagine the scent of wet earth, the clean sweetness of leaves, the warmth of humid air against your skin. Feel your body sinking, heavy in the best way, your muscles loosening, your thoughts thinning like mist that lifts from a field at dawn. There's nothing to solve, nothing to plan, only the quiet, steady rhythm of rest. The greenhouse door has closed for the night. The plants are still. The droplets have stopped falling. Everything settles, and you can settle too. In the darkness, the valley sleeps. In the darkness, the greenhouse sleeps. In the darkness, you drift, safe and unhurried. Good night, dear traveler. Sleep well.